Now we move to the next phase of sort of the American system. So if you visualize back when we were talking last podcast, we were looking at Main Street in Marshalltown, and you actually have, you can see literally visibly the starting dominance of the car and how it literally sort of just pushes the end of Main Street. So, and of course, it's Disneyland counterpart where you intentionally keep the car out artificially. In fact, I should point out just as a note that what you find is a lot of the Main Street projects that have been successful, what they do is they actually cordon off Main Street for pedestrians. I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but they were doing that in Kaka'ako, for example, here, and that's one of the main reasons is to increase the amount of foot traffic. And when we can do that without people getting run over all the time is to basically not allow cars. But what that does is that immediately means you're going to have a large part of your population which isn't going to be able to either be involved or want to be involved because the cars become so central that people, have a hard time doing anything without cars. The number of students on campus that will drive to go to the Times or the Longs, just down the street from campus, literally not even a half block away. Or at least I'm sure it still happens. A number of students will actually drive down to their mailbox in Trenton Hall because they don't want to walk down from their dorm room. That's, it's quintessentially American. In the rest of the world, people walk. Americans, I'm not sure if they know how to walk. So what you have is the car becomes more and more dominant. And of course, at that point, then Marshalltown ceased to have a lot of relevance. Among other things, from a status standpoint, there's no reason to, if you're upscale or trying to be upscale and become more successful, there's no reason to live near downtown because, you've now got a car. So a 5, 10, 20-minute drive can put you, 10, 15, maybe 20 miles away from town. So what happens is cars allow people enormous amounts of perceptual mobility and perceptual distancing. So more and more you can basically define communities entirely around their socioeconomic status by segregating from other communities. If you think of the Marshalltown, what you have is you literally walk from one block to the next and you change your socioeconomic levels, but they're all having to interact with each other because they all had to go down the Main Street. So even though you had people of very divergent socioeconomic means, they were all basically tied to the idea of the town, the center of town, the commercial district. In the modern context, that's entirely absent. And so what you have now is the car and the road dominate. And so when you look at Honolulu as a classic case in point is when you look around is how dominant the cars, roads, driveways, and garages have become in terms of actual functional space. Especially here on an island, it's striking how little space is actually available for homes versus things related to cars that serve no other purpose than tied to cars. So let's very quickly go to an example of this. Okay, so here we've got, I think we're in Palo Alto. Yeah, we're in Palo Alto. So here's, I intentionally just, randomly picked a sort of lower middle class, classic California subdivision. And these things were all built at one point in time. If you ever want to actually see how this all started, it's very, very sophisticated and very complicated in some interesting ways. And the original one was called Levittown. You can actually do that. It's Levitt. Yeah, town. I think that's how it's spelled. And one of the key parts of this is the modern subdivision. Places like this were actually an invention in large part of the federal government. They were designed around the huge concerns that at the end of World War II, you had really millions of veterans and folks that had been in war factories and such like that suddenly were no longer employed because the war had ended. And so what you had to do is you had to find a bunch of people work. It had to be pretty much unskilled work because whatever skills they'd acquired weren't going to be useful. Driving a tank wasn't going to be particularly handy in 1946 in the civilian world. And so what you had to do is you had to find some way to employ huge parts of the population that had limited skills. You also had to find places for them to live because a large part of the American population had been sort of displaced by World War II. The world that they lived in, the small town Marshall towns of the United States, had changed. They had been away from these places for 4, 5, 6 years. A lot of the friends they'd had, that they knew in the old place weren't there anymore. They were dead. They were injured. They had moved somewhere else. And so the United States was a different place after World War II. And the federal government decided what it was going to do is it was going to push the idea that Americans have to live in single family homes. Now, this was part of the whole sort of American settlement logic from the, colonial Williamsburg period to even, Marshalltown and small town America, but it wasn't a requirement. The government basically post-World War sends this huge amount of money and basically propaganda advertising, pushing the idea that real Americans have their own home. That if you want to be a real American, sort of a modern version of that yeoman farmer thing, the real Americans had to have their own home, and then they own their own property, and then it's theirs. So that you're pushing individualism. You've combined the concept of individualism to the idea of residence, and they're inseparable. And the government then sets up the federal, I can remember, the FDIC or whatever the hell, the federal FEMA, or not FEMA, but the various loan programs to help people get houses. And veterans, for example, got special low interest loans so they could actually purchase their first home. Now, it's sort of odd when you think about it, those folks had lived in homes before, obviously. And in many cases, if relatives had passed away, they had access to that home. So what you do is you also push not only having a home, you also push the idea that homes now become socioeconomic measures, that you not only live in a house, but as you become more successful, you upgrade that, and you either upgrade the house by improving it, what we now call home improvement, or what you also do is you then actually sell the house and you move to another house in an upscale neighborhood. So what happens is now the American landscape becomes modularized. It becomes modularized in terms of socioeconomic pockets. So this is a lower middle class pocket. This would have been probably maybe the second home that people would have bought, when these places were built in, say, the 50s or 60s, maybe the first home, when they're actually pretty small. Because people aren't going to be in these permanently, you don't have this idea of centered in place. So you don't have this relationship of place and residence that you do in Marshalltown, and certainly not in Williamsburg. What you have here is in many ways sort of a corollary to Virginia City. People are going to be in these homes for a while. But while they're in these homes, they're working hard and they're saving up money to move into a better home. This is so much part of the American system now, we don't even think about it. It's a huge part of the pressure here on Oahu to develop the last open spaces into subdivisions, because people on Oahu have to have homes. The have to was ironically entirely a government propaganda spin post-World War II. It wasn't part of the American psyche prior to that. But people jumped on it pretty quickly because the government was almost giving away money to do it. If you're building these subdivisions, you're going to build them really quick. Again, you've got largely unskilled labor. So these things were generally not very well put together. They were generally only done to one or two plans. So if you notice, these two places are exactly the same. And that was okay. If you're going to live in these two places forever, you wouldn't be happy with having the place the same as your neighbors, but you're not. You figure you're going to be here statistically for about 4.5 to 5 years, at which point you'll sell this and move into a better home. And these might be called starter homes, though God knows in Palo Alto, they're probably almost $1 million each. Notice how also, when you look at this, notice how dominant the car has become versus Marshalltown, where the cars were on the side and the main area was lawn and green space. What you have here is now a huge part of this area is paved over for the car. You've got a garage. In fact, a garage is a significant chunk of your actual land area that's under roof. So versus what you would see in older communities with the carport or cars outside, now the cars become part of the house. The car is part of the residence. And, that becomes the norm. And again, remember, this is an older community. So notice how this guy upscaled the house versus this one. This one looks pretty original. There's been some changes done. This one's got new siding on it. They've gone and made this more, lower maintenance, but also made it more attractive. They've got a fence up. So they've done some, quote, home improvement, unquote. Here's the third one next to them, same house. They've gone and, filled with the garage door. They put in another type of wall. But again, notice the huge power of the car here. If you actually think about this space, the road is wider than the front yards. And here we've got exactly the same house. Notice how here what you've done, very typical kind of subdivision model. You take this floor plan, you mirror it. In other words, you reverse the floor plan. This house is that house, flipped, like 90 degrees. So the front doors here and the extension parts out here, but they're the same house. And so what you do is you have this exact same house for, let's pop out here and see. And you got a lot of exactly the same house. Look at the roof, they're exactly the same roofs. So what you've got is a ton of exactly the same houses, and these are particular socioeconomic group. Now, I suspect these folks are not as well off socioeconomically. Well, definitely not. But then you've also got folks who live in an area. Let's see if we can find an upscale area here. Here's an old area. It's a little more diverse, a little more dispersed. So what you're going to find is people in that area down here get more successful. They'll buy a bigger home over here. And so aspirationally, they don't see the home they're living in on whatever name one of these streets is here. That's not the final home. In fact, it might not even be the place they plan on raising their kids. They might want to move over here onto Cypress Street. Oh yeah, okay, definitely. Cypress Street, and this is the next home. So notice how there's a little more maintenance, a little more, well, that's, whoops, got a missing one there. And what you've got here is this is a more upscale. These houses are slightly larger, they're a little nicer. But again, if you notice, this house and that house are exactly the same. So it's still a subdivision. In fact, this house and the one across the street, I think, are exactly the same, except with changes. And this drives a whole mess of related industries. One is then you can build a ton of houses really cheap. You can take property that was originally in farms. I think this part of Palo Alto is actually walnut orchards. So, you know, you rip out that and you put these houses in. Notice how we've got a ton of sort of New England-like features here. You don't have the shutters, but you have, you know, the white fence. You've got the idea of brick. You got the idea of permanence and stability. We've also thrown in classics 20th century. Notice again the size of the garage versus the actual floor plan of the house. The size of the area that's given over for car access versus people access. Here you've got the classic Americana part with the idea of mobility. So you live in this house, but during times of the year when you want to, you close the house up and go here, and you can be mobile wherever you want to be. So the absolute dominance of mobility over place. In many ways, if you look at a place like this, you sort of wonder, is the house more important or is the ability to get away more important? And to be honest, I don't think Americans know. Here someone's upscaled themselves and put in another house. But you just look at this and what you've got is the dominance of the car, the dominance of the automobile, the dominance of mobility. And basically these entire communities are transient. Everyone here is there for a while. Gotta love that. So no one's planning on being here forever. I'd be willing to bet that if you ask these people why they did this, one, they thought it was cute. Two, they really think that doing this is going to improve the curb appeal. In fact, their neighbor's done even more here. That's curb appeal. Yeah. So what you do is you have the trees, you landscape this, you have the yard. And in doing so, what you do is you make it a more attractive structure, and that increases its value. So what you get now is community is not the main thing that you value. Value is inherent in the object. And so homes now become commodities. And to a certain extent, that's the modern American system, is the subdivision of the home commodity. And that's why all these people are going to improve it in different ways. You want to, if your neighbor here has this fence, well, this is a nicer fence. And this is why you have Home Depots and Targets and Lowe's and all the rest of those places survive entirely. Home and Garden TV channel would have nothing to do if it weren't for the American fascination with the idea of improving your house to increase its value. So this is, if you want to, this is the world of the realtor. And for those of you in interior design, this is the world of the interior designer. You don't really need interior design except for elite residences. Prior to this, because other people are staying in the same house for their lives. They might change stuff, but they're probably going to do that themselves. In this world, you're going to bring in a professional if you can afford it, because what you want to do is you want to make your house here better than your neighbors. So you bring in someone to tell you what to do and put up a fence and do this and do that, like this person did. And therefore, in changing that place, you're increasing its value, and increasing its value, you're increasing the equity, which means that it gives you more money to go somewhere else and do the same thing all over again. So you've replaced permanence with cash value. And what that also means in many cases is the people here's relationship with the people down the street might be pretty ephemeral. I think one of the classic ways you probably see this would be, let's think of something like, say, Halloween in small town America, like an original Marshalltown. Halloween would be something where little kids could walk down the street and people would give them treats and candies, because everyone knew each other. It was a safe neighborhood, and no one's going to do anything because everyone lives in the same town. In this town, I would suspect people are pretty leery about sending the kids down the street, simply because this guy might have been here for 5 or 10 years, but the people here might have just moved in. these people are getting ready to sell their place. These folks might not be all that new. These folks might be brand new. I mean, you don't know, but you're gonna know guaranteed that a significant portion of the people on the street have been here for less than 5 or 6 years. So getting to know your neighbors is not really going to be a big thing, and there's not really going to be much of a sense of community. This is a residential street that you live on. It has a particular cash value attached to the property and a particular sort of socioeconomic cash value attached to that part of Palo Alto. But it's not a community in the Marshalltown sense. They're very much isolated places, and this is the stereotype of suburban United States. It's people living in isolation, connected by their cars with other people they know, but not necessarily any connection at all with the people they live next to.